Hey, good morning, church. Pastor Matthew here again on Wednesday morning. Thanks for joining me again. As we get started, I want to remind you that tonight is the night. At 7 p.m., we're going to have our Ask a Counselor live stream here on Facebook Live, the same place where I'm at now. And so I encourage you to join us then. By the way, that 7 p.m. is Colorado time, so that's Mountain Daylight time. Yesterday, we finished up our series. We were asking a big question: what does faith look like in crisis and suffering? And we had 5 parts to that. I'm going to start something new today. We're going to be looking in little sections at the book of Ruth. Now, you might be wondering why the book of Ruth. Some of you, if you were with us as a church in 2018, know that we went through it together during our Sunday morning sermon series. And so you might think, well, I've heard this before. And I would suggest to you this: there's a man named Samuel Johnson, who was an English writer many years ago, who said that people need to be reminded much more often than they need to be instructed. And so if you were with us then in 2018, this will be a wonderful reminder. Of course, I know that many of you have joined our community since then, so it'll be new to you as well. Whether you're new or old, the story of Ruth is a story about 2 women. Their names are Ruth and Naomi, and some people have even suggested that the book should be called Naomi rather than Ruth. It is not a story about a pandemic, but it is a story about suffering. And so that's part of the reason we're going to take a look at it. It's a story about suffering, and it's a story for anyone who's trying to reconcile God's love for us with the reality of brokenness and sin in this world. And it's also just a wonderful piece of literature. I'd encourage you to start reading it. I'm not going to read the verses here online, just because part of my goal is to give you very short clips that are quick and easy in your morning. So I'm just going to jump in. We're going to look this morning at verses 1 through 6. So I'd encourage you can either pause and read 1 through 6 now, or you can look at it later. But it's the introduction to our story. And in verse 1, we're told that this is something that happens during the time of the judges. The time of the judges were the awkward teenage years of the nation of Israel. And we find out during this time there happens to be a famine. And one man, his name is Elimelech, decides his response to this famine is going to be to go to Moab. He's going to leave God's people and go live among the nations. He takes with him his wife, that's his wife Naomi, and his 2 sons. Now they live in Moab for some time, but they face tragedy there. Elimelech dies. The 2 sons marry. They don't have any kids, and then they die as well. And so Naomi is left. She's left by herself. She's left without a husband. Her parents are likely dead at this point, and she's left without sons. And in that culture, that would have meant that she's left without a man to help and protect and provide, which would have been critical in the ancient Near East. And so there's this cascade of sorrows that she's facing, and there's no clear option. She's up against a wall. She's between a rock and a hard place. Now, Ruth is a beautiful piece of literature, and there's a lot of play on words that happen. And so what happens here is a little bit behind the scenes, but Elimelech's name actually means God is my king. And they leave the town of Bethlehem when they go to Moab, and Bethlehem means the house of bread. And so there's an implicit question that's being asked here by the author. If the house of bread has no bread, and if God is my king is dead, is God still the king? You might be asking that same question yourself. If my life was normal and easy, and now I'm trapped at home with my kids, is God still the king? If my investments have plummeted and my financial future, which seems so certain and secure, is now up for grabs as my bank account quickly dwindles, is God still the king? If there's a global pandemic and I'm in the at-risk category and there's a chance that I might get sick and the chance that there won't be a respirator for me if I do, is God still the king? That's the question that Ruth is up against in that story, and for us as well. Is God at work in the dark? Is God still in charge, and is he still in control? Well, this question that's behind the scenes, there's also an answer that's behind the scenes as well. We're told, of course, that there's a famine. That's why we left. Attentive readers of this story in the Old Testament would know that famines are often things that God uses ultimately for good. It happens twice in the book of Genesis. In both Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 26, we see a famine that results in blessing ultimately. There's also an implicit barrenness here. We're told that the sons of Naomi and their wives have no children after 10 years of marriage, and so there's barrenness. And readers of this from the Old Testament would know that Sarah from the book of Genesis was also barren, and God used her for the blessing of many nations. Finally, we find out in verse 6 that there's a word from Israel that God had visited his people. It says here in verse 6, she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. And so just at this moment, the very moment when she loses her support system, in God's providence and his plan, not a coincidence, that's the moment that he visits his people in Israel. And then finally, we're told in verse 6 that it's the Lord who had visited him. When the word Lord is used, it's God's personal name, his name Yahweh, his covenant name, which would remind the readers of God's covenant relationship with his people that they are told about throughout the Bible in places like Leviticus and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And then it's finally confirmed in the very last book, the book of Revelation. And the idea of the covenant is this: God tells his people over and over, I will be your God, and you will be my people. And so that name of the Lord would remind the readers, and it would remind Naomi in the midst of the struggle, that God is still their covenant Lord. He's still with them. And so there's an answer here to our big question. The question, of course, is God still the king? Is God still at work in the dark? And the answer is yes. God is still at work. He's at work through famines. He's at work through barrenness. And we know that he is at work because we hear here now that he's visited his people. And so he is still guiding Naomi, providing for her, and protecting her. He has not given up on her. And so he's given her a way, he's given her direction in the midst of her own suffering and her own struggle. The presence of tragedy does not equal the absence of God. The presence of tragedy in our lives does not equal the absence of God. And of course, we can have even greater hope and confidence than Naomi did, because, brothers and sisters, the Lord has visited us in an even greater way. He's visited us by providing his Son, Jesus Christ, to die for us on our behalf and to represent us before God so that we can be God's sons rather than alienated from him. And so how much more have we seen God's goodness and his greatness and his love, even than Naomi in this story and the readers who would receive it in the Old Testament? And so just as it's true for Naomi that God's at work in the dark, it's true for us as well. We have seen even greater proof of God's goodness and his love. We can trust a leader, all right? This is a human principle, who asks more of himself than he does of his followers. And Jesus does that very thing. As we suffer, we know that he's asked even more suffering from himself, that he suffered on the cross even more than we will ever suffer. And so we can trust him and have confidence in him in the midst of suffering, knowing that he has visited us like he visited Naomi, and he's guiding and protecting and guiding us even at this time as he did for her. God is still at work. He's at work in the dark, and he's at work now. Thanks for joining me this morning. I'd encourage you to read the next section of Ruth before tomorrow. That's verses 6 through 18, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully tonight at 7 and tomorrow morning as well. Thanks so much. Bye.